Picture this. Heavy metal titans, absolute rock royalty, suddenly getting challenged for chart supremacy by, wait for it, a guy sitting at a theater organ? Crazy, right? Well, welcome to this explainer, advanced music history students. Today we're diving into what is literally one of the most jarring chart anomalies of the 1970s. We're going to compare two wildly different types of musical mavericks, the soulful, esoteric singer-songwriter Van Morrison and the incredibly popular British theater organists of that exact same era. We'll explore exactly how these artists took deep-rooted traditions and spun them into something culturally disruptive.
So, here's our syllabus for today. We'll kick off with that 1970s chart anomaly, trace the roots of these mavericks, and then break down their art of improvisation. After that, we'll look at how they innovated within their traditions, how they used nostalgia as a form of cultural rebellion, and finally, how they bridged the gap between private creation and huge public communion. All right, let's jump straight into part one, the 1970s chart anomaly and how tradition actually toppled rock royalty. To set the scene, we really need to look at the totally wild contrast in 1970s music evolution. In the early 70s, you've got giants like Led Zeppelin retreating to some secluded Welsh cottage to craft dark, mystical, heavy rock, right? But parallel to this, BBC Radio 2 launches a show called The Organist Entertains. And get this, by the mid-1970s, there was this massive, bizarre shift in public taste. Theater organists, like John McGill, were suddenly achieving legitimate, massive chart success. So how on earth did pure nostalgia go toe-to-toe with heavy metal? Well, honestly, the fundamental reason behind this clash really just comes down to sheer sonic power. Progressive rock bands were out there striving for this grand, cinematic sound, hauling around massive walls of modern amplifiers. But the thing is, the theater pipe organ already had that sound, literally built right into it. These were massive pneumatic sound machines, originally designed back in the silent film era to mimic an entire orchestra. They were, without a doubt, the original larger-than-life sound system. Moving on to part two, roots of the Mavericks. Let's look at the historical foundations these artists built upon. So Van Morrison built his incredibly modern sound on a solid bedrock of American blues and British skiffle. He was deeply influenced by artists like Leadbelly. On the flip side, organists like Reginald Dixon rooted their entire creative approach in the working-class familiarity of music hall classics. In fact, Dixon famously used the 1907 hit I Do Like to Be Beside the Seaside as his signature tune. He was deliberately using this deep collective nostalgia to anchor his massive modern performances right in a shared cultural memory. It's actually a brilliant strategy when you think about it. Morrison, as you know, absorbed complex jazz techniques like vocalese. Basically, that's the art of writing and singing lyrics over pre-existing instrumental solos. He treated his voice just like a dynamic instrument, totally capable of spontaneous dexterity. And there's a striking parallel here. Theater organists treated their massive machines not just as simple keyboards, but as full-blown orchestras. They physically manipulated the mechanisms to coax out these highly expressive, almost vocal-like tones. Okay, let's get into part three, the art of improvisation and how they mastered the live moment. While Morrison's ideal was famously fluid, he literally never wanted to sing a song the same way twice, relying on deep emotional spontaneity. The theater organists relied on something completely different, highly technical mechanical improvisation. They used complex transportable setups like the Foort system and relied heavily on adjustable pistons. These are essentially physical preset buttons that let them change vast combinations of sounds instantly. It was a rigorous mechanical manipulation, but it was absolutely necessary to capture that same live, spontaneous magic. A crucial piece of this puzzle is the Blackpool style, which was pioneered by Reginald Dixon. This was this incredibly bouncy, rhythmic technique that relied on a strong left-hand bass and a melody played via what's called second touch. That's a physical technique where pressing the keys down just a bit harder triggers a second, punchier set of pipes. Dixon had to keep thousands, yes, thousands of holidaymakers dancing in strict tempo at the Tower Ballroom. So this totally shatters the illusion that organ playing was just sitting quietly in a dark room. It demanded immense rhythmic improvisation to cut right through the noise of those massive dance floors. Let's pivot to part four, innovating within the tradition, and how they adapted to the modern era. Now, both of these mavericks adapted their repertoires brilliantly. Morrison didn't just passively recite local folk tunes, he drastically rearranged them. Take the McPeak's Wild Mountain Thyme, he completely injected it with modern soul dynamics. Meanwhile, organist Phil Kelsall took a decidedly more, let's say, humorous approach. He would literally take massive disco hits like the Village People's YMCA and strictly convert them into traditional tango formats. I know, it sounds absurd, but it worked flawlessly and crowds went wild for it. On top of that, organists had to technically adapt to the organ reform movement, which shifted focus toward neoclassic tonal designs. So both sides were constantly blending historical fidelity with massive contemporary appeal. Just to put the sheer physical scale of this adaptation into perspective, think about the number 1034. That is the exact number of pipes in the Blackpool Tower's 1935 Wurlitzer. To innovate on a machine like that required immense technical skill. You had to master high wind pressures, pushing up to 15 inches, plus navigate all its complex electronic relays. It was an absolute beast of a machine, and pulling modern sounds out of it was a massive physical and mechanical feat.
Which brings us to part 5. Nostalgia as cultural rebellion. This is all about the radical act of looking back. Consider this really powerful quote from Van Morrison. Blues isn't to do with black or white. Blues is about the truth, and blues is the truth. He used these truthful forms of the past not as some sort of retreat, but as a full-on maverick rebellion. For those of you tracking cultural evolution, this is a major takeaway. In a decade of rapidly shifting, sometimes sterile pop trends, digging deep into authentic roots was his way of finding genuine connection and resisting the commercial homogenization of modern music. To really grasp the weight of this cultural evolution, we just have to look at the immense scale of the theater organ revival. I want to be clear, this was not some fringe novelty. Even today, Phil Kelsall plays to over 110,000 attendees annually. That's enough to fill a major stadium, and it perfectly echoes the massive record sales we saw during the 1970s organ revival, when these albums were dominating the upper echelons of the charts. It just proves that this specific brand of active nostalgia had staggering commercial and cultural resonance. And that brings us to another Morrison's quote that really hits the philosophical core of our analysis. You find out that what you've been searching for, you already are. By actively looking backward, these artists actually found themselves, embracing those deep cultural roots, whether it was Morrison's Irish heritage or the organist's beloved seaside music halls, is exactly what fueled their greatest artistic breakthroughs and their massive popularity. Let's look at our final section, part 6, bridging private and public, going from solitary practice to mass communion. As music historians, the big takeaway here is how these mavericks managed to bridge their incredibly isolated creative processes with massive public engagement. First, you have the private exploration, Morrison's esoteric writing, or the organist's solitary, highly technical registration building. Next comes the adaptation, where they translate those complex, private impulses into accessible live formats. And finally, the public communion, delivering these totally unrepeatable moments to massive crowds. I mean, the Wurlitzer alone has played for over 10,000 hours to packed dance floors. They literally turned solitary practice into sheer communal joy. Ultimately, this is the perfect synthesis of intimacy and scale. Morrison channeled intimate, stripped-down influences like the traditional singer John McCormack, yet he somehow elevated that individual expression to a massive, stadium-sized scale. And honestly, this perfectly mirrors the organist's journey. They went from providing solitary background accompaniment for silent films all the way to achieving standalone chart dominance and commanding vast echoing ballrooms. It's a real game changer when you step back and look at it. So we've seen just how powerful innovating with tradition can be, right? We've seen how a silent film organist could step up and compete with the absolute titans of heavy metal simply by tapping into the unadulterated nostalgia of the public. So I'm going to leave you with this question to chew on. If nostalgia possessed the power to topple rock royalty in the 1970s, what forgotten piece of musical history is poised to disrupt our modern landscape next? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep listening closely.